Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt that something was off even when nobody said a word? You notice the pause in someone's voice, the look on their face, the energy between two people, and the tiny details everyone else seems to ignore. You might not be imagining things, your brain may simply be paying attention to what most people overlook. And that's exactly what we're exploring in this video. Not some fantasy about having a sixth sense, but the real psychology behind why certain people notice patterns, emotions, inconsistencies, and subtle changes faster than others. Because sometimes the things you notice aren't random. They reveal how your brain observes, processes, and makes sense of the world around you. Stay with me until the end, because you may finally understand why you can walk into a situation and notice something everyone else somehow missed. Most people call it sharp intuition, a great gift of intelligence. But the truth is, this ability is actually a harsh psychological burden, because seeing through everything always comes with a heavy price. These people can't just switch off their minds to act naive and keep normal social relationships. Constantly noticing fake behavior pushes them into isolation, doubt, and complete emotional exhaustion. Not because they're unstable, but because they carry the weight of truths that no one else understands. This is an extremely dangerous line to walk. This rare level of awareness will either slowly destroy them or turn them into someone extraordinary. Today, we're going to break down the psychology of people who see what others don't, and how they can avoid being consumed by their own minds. Welcome back. I'm Apex. Let's get started. To understand why some people can see what others miss, we need to take the spiritual angle off the table. From a neuroscience point of view, this comes from high-speed data processing called thin slicing, combined with the ability to detect incongruence. Imagine the average human brain as an audience watching a play. They look at the stage and believe everything the actors say. But the brain of a highly perceptive person works differently. Their subconscious automatically watches the velvet curtain behind the stage. They notice the broken props, the prompter's hand, the actor's nervous sweat. Their brain is a 247 data collection machine, always searching for technical errors in behavior. Human beings communicate through two channels, verbal and nonverbal. Most people only focus on words, but people who see through things have a built-in radar system that is extremely sensitive to the nonverbal channel. They pay attention to what Dr. Paul Ekman calls micro-expressions, tiny facial movements that flash by in just 115 to 125 of a second, revealing the real emotion a person is trying to hide. When a coworker says, "I'm really happy you got promoted," the perceptive person immediately catches the incongruence. They hear the voice rise half a tone, see that the smile does not reach the corners of the eyes, or catch a quick flicker of jealousy. The brain instantly sends up an alert, data error. The words in the body do not match. This is a lie. This process happens unconsciously and in a flash. It is like tasting a bowl of soup and knowing it is salty. They do not need to overthink it. The tongue simply reports the truth. But the scariest part is not seeing the lie. It is seeing the reason behind it. When pattern recognition combines with theory of mind, they strip away the mask and see the other person's insecurity and fear. They look at a boss who is yelling and see a child terrified of losing control. They look at someone who keeps bragging and see a pit of insecurity craving validation. That may sound like a huge advantage in communication, but in reality, seeing through people often pushes them into three exhausting psychological traps. Trap 1. Becoming the accidental villain. In Greek mythology, there was a prophetess named Cassandra. Apollo gave her a wonderful gift, the ability to see the future and know the truth. But that gift came with a cruel curse. No one would ever believe what she said. Cassandra always saw disaster before it arrived. She screamed warnings, but people only saw her as crazy, negative, and disruptive. People with these see-through eyes in modern life are the Cassandras of social relationships. The truth is, human society is built on polite lies and masks. We need masks to survive, to keep work running smoothly, to keep families peaceful. Everyone silently agrees to take part in a shared performance, and then they show up. The people who refuse to wear sunglasses, the ones carrying a giant spotlight and shining it straight into the dark, moldy corners everyone is trying to keep hidden. Let's look at what happens in a dating situation. They meet someone on a dating app. From the very first coffee date, the other person shows up polished and charming, talking non-stop about billion-dollar projects, luxury trips, and acting like the perfect gentleman or dream partner. A normal guy or girl might be overwhelmed, fall into admiration, and believe they have met fate, but not them. Their radar has already scanned the other person's whole psychological structure within 15 minutes. They realize that overconfidence is actually a form of overcompensation. They notice the constant eye movements checking for reactions, proving that the person is performing, not living naturally. They recognize that rushed enthusiasm as a hidden manipulation script. When they tell their friends, this person feels way too fake. Their friends look at them like they are paranoid and ruining their own happiness. You're too picky. They seem so nice because the crowd only sees the tip of the iceberg while they see what is underneath. With no proof other than intuition, nobody believes them. They become the bad guy in their own story. Things get even worse in the workplace or inside friend groups. When they have this kind of insight, they accidentally take away other people's chance to play their role. When one coworker keeps complaining and acting like a victim of a cruel boss to win sympathy from the whole office, everyone comforts them. But the person with sharp perception knows the truth. They know this coworker is actually missing deadlines, working irresponsibly, and using tears to manipulate public opinion. They do not comfort them. Sometimes they just let out one simple realistic comment. Honestly, if you had managed your time better on this project, your boss probably would not have said that. And boom, the whole mood changes instantly. That coworker turns on them with sharp hatred. Why? In psychoanalysis, this is called projection and ego defense. When the true nature a person is trying to hide gets exposed, they go through intense shame and humiliation. To protect a collapsing ego, the brain strikes back. They do not admit the truth. Instead, they turn the perceptive person into the villain. They start saying that person is cold, arrogant, judgmental, and lacking empathy. As we can see, truth is expensive. When these people see through others, they do not earn respect. They create fear. They make other people feel psychologically naked. And by survival instinct, human beings always want to destroy the person who holds their secrets. Little by little, people with this ability learn a cruel rule. Their clarity makes others uncomfortable. So they choose silence. They smile and nod. They pretend not to know. But that silence creates a huge empty space in the soul and pushes them into an even scarier trap. Trap 2. The reading people obsession and overthinking. When they can't trust what others say, they start trusting only their own analysis. This is when observation stops being a helpful tool and turns into a toxic risk control mechanism. Let's call this the detective trap. Because these people are so used to spotting lies behind smiles, they begin to assume that everything has a hidden meaning. Nothing feels as simple as it looks. They lose their innocence in relationships. A compliment from a partner is never just a compliment. It feels like a setup for a future favor. A gift from a lover is not seen as romance. Their brain immediately asks, what is he feeling guilty about? A reply that comes 30 minutes late is not because the other person is busy. It becomes a sign of distance, a loss of priority, the beginning of the end. They trap themselves in a loop of constant high alert. What is the real purpose of this vigilance? To never get hurt. They stay in this loop to protect themselves. They believe that if they can predict every betrayal, they won't feel pain when it happens. Their sensitivity turns into psychological armor. But this armor is too heavy, and it blocks all real emotions. By constantly analyzing and guessing, they fall into a dangerous thinking error called confirmation bias, when they believe someone is hiding something. Their brain filters all information to prove that belief is right and ignores anything that says otherwise. They see their partner's tired eyes after a long day and instantly interpret it as she's getting bored of me. They stop trusting the present because they are busy living inside 10 worst-case scenarios of the future. They win every mental game. They expose every mask. They never get fooled. But the price is they can never relax. Innocence, unconditional trust, the peace of resting your head on someone's shoulder without overthinking, those become luxuries. They're like someone with extremely sensitive hearing, able to hear the cracks in a building before it collapses. It helps them survive, but it takes away their ability to enjoy music because every sound is analyzed as a threat. And the exhaustion does not just come from overthinking. It also comes from another invisible weight, the burden of unspoken truths. Trap 3. Becoming an emotional dumping ground. There is a very strange kind of loneliness that only people who see everything can understand. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of standing in a crowd, watching a tragedy unfold, and not being able to say a word. They attend a close friend's wedding. Everyone is cheering and celebrating, but through the groom's glance at the bridesmaid or the bride's forced smile hiding anxiety, they know the marriage is built on sand. They see the collapse at the very moment of celebration, yet they still raise a glass and say, "Wishing you a lifetime of happiness." It feels like knowing the Titanic is about to sink while standing in first class, watching everyone dance. They cannot warn anyone because no one would believe them and they would ruin the moment. Or they see a kind co-worker being taken advantage of again and again by a manipulative toxic boss. They see the exhaustion in that coworker's eyes, but they also know that if they step in, if they tell the truth, it will be denied because to survive, that coworker is using denial, a protective shield they have no right to take away. Holding all these truths slowly drains their life energy. It creates a quiet, chronic heaviness. They feel compassion for people who do not realize they are being deceived. Yet at the same time, they feel disgust toward the fake masks of the world. Their mind is stuck between deep empathy and bitter skepticism. And the saddest part, because they are so good at reading people, they understand others' needs before a single word is spoken. They know how to act in ways that please everyone, becoming great diplomats. But in return, no one reads them. No one knows what they truly need or where they are hurting. People assume they are too strong, too smart to need protection. The one who heals the world becomes like a glass wall. They see through everyone, but when others look at them, they only see their own reflection. So what is the way out for a mind that cannot stop seeing the truth? They cannot simply switch off their sensitivity. Forcing themselves to think less is like asking someone with perfect 20/20 vision to pretend everything is blurry. It is impossible. The goal is not to see less. The goal is to change how they respond to what they see. In therapeutic psychology, this kind of transformation requires them to build cognitive boundaries and practice the following 3 survival principles. Principle 1. Strategic ignorance. This is the art of knowing everything but not reacting to everything. Clearly separate truth from responsibility. They see a coworker obviously sucking up to the boss in a fake way. That's the truth. But the real question is it their job to expose that person? No. Does it affect their KPIs? No, then treat it like a cloud passing across the sky. They can see it's gray, but they don't need to fly up and push it away. Leave behind the ego that wants to play the Lord of Truth. Their ability to see through things is a tool for gathering information, helping them make safer decisions for themselves. For example, not working with that fake person, not a weapon to judge or clean up the world. Principle 2. Accept social masks. The suffering of perceptive people often comes from having standards that are too high when it comes to authenticity. They expect everyone to be real, to be transparent, but look again with more empathy through a psychological lens. Why do people wear masks? It's not always to deceive or harm. Most people wear masks to hide wounds, insecurity, and the fear of not being loved. That loud bragging guy at the table is really just a boy craving attention. The friend who always seems cold and arrogant is actually shaking inside, afraid of being betrayed again. Sometimes a lie is the only thing keeping them from falling apart. Once they understand this, anger or disgust toward fake behavior starts to fade. In its place comes radical acceptance. They see the mask, but they don't rip it off. They simply smile and allow the other person to feel safe inside it. The greatest form of understanding is not exposing someone's weakness, but seeing it clearly and still choosing to treat them with kindness. Principle 3. Forgive the blind spots of the present. To escape the detective trap, they must accept one risk. Stop trying to control the future. When their radar signals that a partner might be lying, they can acknowledge it, store it in the back of their mind, but not let it ruin the present moment. If their intuition says there's a 20% chance the relationship could end badly, they should have the courage to accept the 20% and still enjoy the 80% of joy right now. Living fully requires the courage to sometimes get hurt. They can see the thorns on a rose, but if they keep analyzing how sharp each thorn is, they will never smell the flower. Allow themselves at times to be intentionally blind so the mind can rest and the heart can beat like a normal person's. When they learn to let go like this, something almost magical happens. Their ability to observe doesn't disappear. It evolves into something greater, true wisdom. They are no longer a cold X-ray machine exposing every flaw. They become a quiet lighthouse. They see all the hidden rocks and dangerous currents, but instead of panicking, they calmly guide their ship through. This level of perception is a brutal gift, but also the most beautiful one if they learn how to master it. Eventually, they begin to understand something that changes everything. The goal was never to become the smartest person in the room. The goal was to become the most emotionally balanced person in the room. Because perception without emotional regulation eventually becomes suffering. Imagine carrying a microscope everywhere you go. Every tiny crack looks enormous. Every small inconsistency demands your attention. Every flaw becomes impossible to ignore. That's exactly what happens inside the mind of someone who constantly sees beneath the surface. Their greatest strength slowly becomes their greatest source of fatigue. Psychologists often describe this as cognitive overload. The brain is receiving far more information than it can comfortably process. While everyone else notices 1 or 2 social signals, they notice 20. A slight pause before someone answers, a nervous swallow, a change in breathing, the way someone suddenly avoids eye contact after mentioning a particular subject. None of these observations are imagined. Most of them are real. The challenge is that not every observation deserves interpretation. Sometimes a pause is simply a pause. Sometimes someone is tired. Sometimes anxiety has absolutely nothing to do with you. One of the healthiest psychological shifts these individuals can make is learning the difference between observation and conclusion. Observation says, I notice something's changed. Conclusion says, I know exactly why it changed. Those are 2 completely different things. Highly perceptive people are usually excellent at the first. The danger begins when they become too confident about the second. Even psychology reminds us that human behavior is incredibly complex. No single expression, gesture, or moment can reveal an entire personality. Parts matter more than isolated events. This realization allows their mind to finally breathe. Instead of trying to solve every person they meet, they become curious. Instead of assuming motives, they leave room for uncertainty. Ironically, this makes their perception even more accurate because curiosity sees more than certainty ever can. There is another transformation that quietly happens. People who spend years observing others eventually realize that the person they understand the least is often themselves. They have become experts at reading everyone else's emotions. Yet, they rarely stop long enough to ask, what am I feeling right now? They know when someone else is anxious, but ignore their own anxiety. They recognize insecurity in others, yet dismiss their own emotional exhaustion. Psychologists call this emotional displacement. Attention becomes permanently directed outward, while the inner world quietly waits to be acknowledged. This explains why many highly perceptive individuals suddenly reach a point where they feel emotionally empty without understanding why. They spent years watching everyone else's stories unfold, but forgot to participate in their own. Perhaps the greatest act of psychological maturity is realizing that your gift was never meant to be used only for understanding other people. It was also meant to understand yourself with the same patience, the same compassion, the same curiosity. Imagine if every time you noticed another person's hidden pain, you also paused long enough to notice your own. Imagine if the empathy you freely offered strangers became something you allowed yourself to receive as well. That single shift changes everything because perception without self-compassion becomes self-neglect. But perception combined with self-awareness creates wisdom. And wisdom is very different from intelligence. Intelligence notices patterns. Wisdom knows which patterns deserve attention. Intelligence detects danger. Wisdom knows when danger exists only inside old memories. Intelligence can explain human behavior. Wisdom understands that not every mystery needs to be solved. Not every silence needs to be interpreted. Not every mask needs to be removed. Sometimes the healthiest response is simply to observe, smile, and continue living your own life. That is where true freedom begins. Not when you stop seeing what others don't, but when what you see no longer controls how you feel. Because the rarest ability isn't seeing through people. The rarest ability is seeing clearly while still protecting your own peace. There is one final psychological habit that separates people who merely notice hidden details from those who learn to live peacefully with that awareness. They eventually stop trying to be right all the time. At first, this sounds strange. After all, if your intuition is accurate, if your observations repeatedly prove to be true, wouldn't it make sense to trust them completely? To a certain degree, yes, but psychology teaches something remarkably important. Being perceptive is not the same as being omniscient. No matter how sharp your perception becomes, you are still interpreting reality through the filter of your own experiences. That means every observation deserves humility. Highly perceptive people who remain emotionally healthy develop an interesting habit. Instead of saying, "I know exactly what's happening," they quietly tell themselves this is one possible explanation. That single sentence creates psychological flexibility. It leaves room for surprise. It leaves room for misunderstanding. Most importantly, it leaves room for people to be more complicated than first impressions suggest. Another transformation begins when they stop measuring intelligence by how accurately they read other people. Instead, they begin measuring it by how peacefully they can live, despite not knowing everything. Because uncertainty isn't a flaw in life, it's one of life's permanent conditions. No relationship comes with complete certainty. No friendship, no career, no future. Trying to eliminate uncertainty is like trying to stop the wind. The effort itself becomes exhausting. But psychologists often observe that emotional resilience doesn't come from predicting every outcome. It comes from trusting your ability to respond when outcomes change. That realization quietly changes the nervous system. Instead of remaining permanently alert, it finally learns how to rest. There is also another hidden strength that develops in people who have mastered this rare level of perception. They become remarkably difficult to manipulate, not because they distrust everyone, because they no longer need everyone. There is an important difference. Someone who constantly fears betrayal becomes suspicious. Someone who has developed genuine inner security becomes discerning. Suspicion expects deception everywhere. Discernment simply observes and waits for evidence. That distinction protects both peace and relationships. It allows them to remain open-hearted without becoming naive. Perhaps this is the balance psychology has been pointing toward all along. Not blind trust, not permanent skepticism, but calm awareness. Another fascinating shift occurs in the way they experience conflict earlier in life. They often felt responsible for exposing every contradiction they noticed, every inconsistency, every hidden motive, every uncomfortable truth. Eventually, experience teaches them something profound. Not every truth creates healing. Timing matters. Readiness matters. Compassion matters. A truth delivered to someone who is emotionally unprepared often feels like an attack rather than a gift. This is why emotionally mature people don't ask, "Is this true?" They also ask, "Is this helpful? Is this necessary? Is this the right moment?" Sometimes wisdom remains silent, not because it fears the truth, but because it understands human psychology. People rarely change because someone proved them wrong. They change when they're finally ready to see themselves differently. Perhaps that's why the wisest observers slowly become quieter, not because they notice less, because they understand more. They recognize that every person is carrying invisible battles, invisible fears, invisible wounds. Some are ready to face them, others aren't. And forcing awareness onto someone before they're prepared rarely creates growth. It usually creates resistance. Finally, there is one lesson that almost every deeply perceptive person eventually discovers. For years, they believed their greatest gift was seeing through people. But over time, they realized their greatest gift was something much rarer. the ability to remain compassionate after seeing what lies beneath the surface. Anyone can become cynical after witnessing enough deception. Anyone can become emotionally distant after enough disappointment, but choosing understanding instead of bitterness, choosing wisdom instead of superiority, choosing peace instead of constant psychological warfare. That is where true emotional intelligence begins. Because the purpose of perception was never to make you feel above other people. It was to help you understand them more deeply. And perhaps in doing so, understand yourself a little better as well. And perhaps the most unexpected change happens when they finally stop seeing their perception as an identity. For years, they may have believed, I am the person who always sees the truth. It becomes part of how they define themselves, the observer, the analyst, the one who notices what everyone else misses. While that identity can feel empowering, it can also become another psychological trap, because once you identify too strongly with any single ability, you begin feeling responsible for using it all the time. You start scanning every conversation, every relationship, every room you enter, not because you have to, because your mind believes that's who you are. Psychology reminds us that identity is powerful. The stories we tell ourselves eventually shape the way we experience the world. If your identity becomes, I must always detect hidden motives, your brain will search for hidden motives everywhere. If your identity becomes, I understand people better than they understand themselves, you may slowly lose the willingness to let people surprise you. And that is where genuine curiosity begins to disappear. Another quiet shift takes place in relationships. Highly perceptive people often spend years trying to predict whether someone will eventually hurt them. They observe, test, wait, analyze, sometimes for months. The irony is that race relationships were never meant to be solved like mathematical equations. They were meant to be experienced. No amount of observation can completely eliminate emotional risk. No amount of pattern recognition can guarantee that another human being will never disappoint you. Because people change. Circumstances change. Even the most sincere individuals make mistakes. Accepting this uncertainty doesn't weaken perception. It simply allows the heart to participate alongside the mind. There is also something fascinating about how these individuals experience trust. Many people think trust is built by gathering enough evidence, but psychology suggests that trust always involves a small leap beyond certainty. Evidence matters, character matters, consistency matters. But eventually, every meaningful relationship reaches a point where certainty ends and vulnerability begins. That step can feel terrifying to someone whose mind is trained to notice every possible warning sign. Yet it is also the only path toward genuine human connection. Without vulnerability, relationships become investigations. With vulnerability, they become experiences. Another lesson emerges with time. People who once believed they had to understand. Everyone eventually realized something liberating. Not everyone wants to be understood. Some people simply want to be accepted. Some aren't ready to face the deeper reasons behind their own behavior. Others protect themselves with stories they've repeated for years. Trying to force awareness onto them rarely creates transformation. Real psychological growth almost always begins from within. It cannot be imposed from the outside. Recognizing this removes an enormous emotional burden. You stop feeling responsible for fixing everyone you meet. You stop believing every hidden wound is yours to heal. Instead, you become present, compassionate, available when someone genuinely seeks understanding, but no longer consumed by the need to rescue every struggling person who crosses your path. Perhaps that is the deepest evolution of all. The beginning of this journey is marked by observation. The middle is often marked by exhaustion. But the final stage is marked by peace. You still notice the subtle facial expressions. You still recognize the contradictions. You still sense the emotions that remain unspoken. The difference is that these observations no longer disturb your inner world. They simply become information. You acknowledge them, you learn from them, and then you let them pass. Because true psychological strength isn't measured by how much you can perceive. It's measured by how much peace you can preserve while perceiving it. In the end, the rarest minds aren't the ones that constantly prove they're right. They're the ones that quietly understand people, remain humble about what they don't know, and protect their own emotional well-being without losing their compassion for others. That is when perception stops being a burden and becomes wisdom. So, what does all of this really tell us? If you recognized yourself in many of these patterns, it doesn't necessarily mean you possess a rare gift that no one else has. Human perception exists on a spectrum, and psychology cannot determine someone's abilities from a single list of traits. But it does suggest that some people naturally pay closer attention to emotional cues, behavioral patterns, and subtle inconsistencies than others. The real question isn't whether you see more. It's what you choose to do with what you see. For a long time, you may have believed that your ability to notice what others miss was both your greatest strength and your greatest curse. You may have wondered why certain conversations leave you exhausted, why crowded rooms sometimes feel emotionally overwhelming, or why trusting people has never come easily. But perhaps the problem was never your perception itself. Perhaps it was carrying the impossible responsibility of believing you had to understand everyone, predict every outcome, and protect yourself from every possible disappointment. Psychology reminds us that awareness is only one part of emotional intelligence. The other part is knowing when to stop analyzing, knowing when an observation is simply information rather than a threat, knowing when to let uncertainty exist without forcing your mind to solve it. Because the healthiest minds are not those that control every situation. They are the ones that remain calm even when life cannot be completely understood. One of the greatest misconceptions about highly perceptive people is that they always have life figured out. In reality, they often spend years learning that understanding others is far easier than understanding themselves. They become experts at reading hidden emotions while quietly ignoring their own. They offer compassion to everyone around them, but rarely extend the same kindness inward. True psychological growth begins the moment that changes. Perhaps the greatest transformation isn't becoming better at seeing through people. It's becoming better at seeing yourself with honesty, patience, and compassion. It's realizing that not every hidden motive deserves your attention. Not every contradiction deserves your energy. Not every mask needs to be removed. Sometimes the wisest response is to observe quietly, learn what you need to learn, and continue protecting your own peace. Because in the end, the rarest ability isn't simply seeing what others don't. And once you start paying attention to these subtle details, you may realize something else about yourself. You don't simply notice what people say. You notice whether their behavior matches what they're saying. Someone can tell you they're completely fine, but you notice that their voice is slightly flatter than usual. Someone can say they're excited about something, but their body language doesn't match the enthusiasm in their words. Someone can smile while talking to you, yet something about the timing, the expression, or the way they avoid eye contact tells you there may be something underneath the surface. That doesn't mean you're always right, and this distinction is important. Psychology doesn't suggest that people who notice subtle cues can magically read minds. Human beings are complicated, and our interpretations can be wrong. But some people naturally pay closer attention to patterns of behavior. Context, facial expressions, tone, and inconsistencies. Their brains collect more pieces of information before forming an impression. You may have experienced this without even realizing it. You're sitting with a group of people. Everyone is laughing. The conversation seems completely normal, but you suddenly notice that one person has become unusually quiet. Nobody else seems concerned. You don't interrupt the conversation or make a dramatic announcement. You simply register it. Later, you discover that something actually was bothering them. That's pattern recognition in everyday life. Your brain is constantly comparing what is happening now with what it has observed before. A person's normal behavior becomes a baseline, and when something changes, even slightly, your attention may pick it up. The difference might be tiny. A shorter response, a different tone, less eye contact, a pause where there normally isn't one, a change in someone's usual energy. Most people aren't necessarily incapable of noticing these things. They're simply not paying attention to them in the same way. And that's an important distinction, because attention is selective. Your brain cannot process every detail in your environment with equal intensity. It has to decide what deserves attention and what can be ignored. Some people naturally direct more attention towards social information, emotional changes, or environmental inconsistencies. This can be incredibly useful, but it can also become exhausting. Because when your brain becomes very good at detecting subtle changes, it may sometimes detect changes that don't actually mean anything. A friend takes longer than usual to reply, and suddenly your mind starts constructing explanations. Someone's expression changes during a conversation, and you begin wondering whether you said something wrong. You walk into a room and sense tension, but you can't tell whether the tension is actually there or whether you're simply picking up on your own anxiety. This is where observation and interpretation need to be separated. Noticing something is one process. Deciding what that something means is another. And people who are highly observant sometimes struggle because they move from observation to interpretation so quickly that they don't even realize they've made the jump. They don't just think, their tone changed. Their brain immediately adds, they're angry with me. But those are two completely different statements. The first is an observation. The second is a conclusion. Learning to separate the two can make your awareness much more accurate. You can notice everything without believing every interpretation your mind produces, and that may be one of the most valuable skills for someone who naturally sees what others miss, learning that awareness doesn't require certainty. You can say, something feels different here, without immediately deciding why. You can notice someone's silence without assuming they're upset with you. You can recognize a change in someone's behavior while still allowing room for other explanations. That combination, high observation with intellectual humility, is far more powerful than simply being hyper alert. Because the goal isn't to notice everything. The goal is to notice what matters. And once you understand that difference, your observations can become much more useful. Instead of immediately reacting to every tiny change, you begin collecting information. You watch the pattern over time. You notice whether the behavior happens once or repeatedly. You consider the situation the person is in. You ask yourself whether there are explanations you haven't considered yet. In other words, your awareness becomes less reactive and more analytical. This is where people who notice what others miss can develop a surprisingly powerful ability. They learn to delay judgment. You might hear someone make a comment that sounds strange, but instead of immediately labeling them as rude, you wonder what happened before the conversation. You notice someone behaving differently, but instead of assuming they're angry, you consider that they might be tired, distracted, nervous, or dealing with something completely unrelated to you. You're still noticing the signal, but you're not allowing the first explanation your brain produces to become the truth. That habit requires something many people underestimate: cognitive flexibility. Your first interpretation isn't always the correct one. Being intelligent doesn't mean having an instant answer for everything. Sometimes intelligence looks like being comfortable saying, I don't know yet. And this may explain why you sometimes seem quiet in situations where other people are reacting immediately. While everyone else is forming opinions, you're still gathering information. You're watching what happens next. You're comparing words with actions. You're trying to understand the bigger picture before deciding what you think. People might mistake that for hesitation, but sometimes you're not hesitant at all. You're processing. Your mind is allowing more information into the decision before committing to a conclusion. This can become especially noticeable in relationships. You may remember small details about people that they don't even remember telling you. You notice which topics make someone uncomfortable. You remember how they behaved during difficult moments, not just how they behaved when everything was going well. You pay attention to consistency. And consistency tells you something that words alone cannot. Anyone can say they care. The more revealing question is whether their behavior repeatedly demonstrates it. Anyone can apologize. The more revealing question is whether their behavior changes afterward. Anyone can promise to be there. The more revealing question is whether they actually show up when being there becomes inconvenient. This doesn't mean you should become suspicious of everyone. It means you understand that human behavior is usually more informative when observed over time. You may have learned this naturally because your brain doesn't just collect isolated moments. It connects them. One interaction doesn't necessarily mean much, but 10 similar interactions create a pattern. And patterns are where your attention becomes particularly valuable. You might even find yourself noticing patterns in environments, not just people. You walk into a workplace and immediately sense whether communication is healthy. You enter a new social group and notice who dominates the conversation, who gets interrupted, who everyone looks toward before making a decision, and who seems to be quietly influencing the room without saying much. Again, you aren't necessarily consciously analyzing every detail. Your brain may simply be absorbing information in the background. That's why sometimes you can't immediately explain why you don't trust a situation. You just know that something doesn't feel right. And before you treat that feeling as either absolute truth or meaningless anxiety, there is a better approach. Ask yourself, what exactly did I notice? Not, what's wrong here? Not, who is the bad person? Simply, what did I actually observe? Maybe someone contradicted themselves. Maybe their behavior changed when a particular person entered the room. Maybe the environment became unusually quiet after a certain topic came up. Maybe their words sounded positive, but their actions consistently communicated something different. Once you identify the actual observation, you can evaluate it without letting imagination fill in the missing pieces. That is mature observation. And it can protect you from two opposite mistakes: ignoring important signals and inventing meanings that aren't there. Because sometimes your instinct is picking up on something real, and sometimes your brain is simply trying to create a story from incomplete information. Knowing the difference is the real skill, and once you become aware of that difference, you may start noticing another unusual quality in yourself. You remember details that other people seem to forget almost immediately. Not necessarily dates, names, or random facts, but moments. The exact way someone reacted when you told them something important. The hesitation before they answered. The expression on their face when a particular subject came up. The small promise they made months ago and whether they actually followed through. You may not consciously try to remember these things. They simply stay with you. Your brain appears to treat certain details as meaningful, especially when they help you understand a person, situation, or pattern. That's why you can sometimes remember a 5-second interaction from years ago while completely forgetting an ordinary conversation from last week. The difference isn't necessarily memory capacity, it's significance. Your mind tends to hold on to information that feels emotionally or psychologically relevant, and this can make you unusually difficult to fool. Not because you're suspicious of everyone, but because inconsistencies stand out to you. Someone tells you one thing today and something completely different next month, and you remember. Someone repeatedly behaves in a way that contradicts the image they're presenting, and eventually you notice the pattern. You don't necessarily confront them. Sometimes you simply update your understanding of who they are. That's an important distinction. Highly observant people don't always announce what they've discovered. In fact, some of them become quieter when they notice something important. They listen more carefully. They reveal less. They stop arguing with what they're seeing and start paying attention to what actually happens next. And this is one reason people may underestimate you. They may assume that because you're quiet, you aren't paying attention. But silence and absence of awareness are not the same thing. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has noticed the most. You've probably experienced moments where someone tells you something and you immediately notice a contradiction. But you don't say anything because you want to give them the opportunity to explain themselves. That's not weakness, it's restraint. You understand that one unusual behavior isn't enough to define a person. You give people room to clarify. You observe whether the explanation matches their future behavior, and if the pattern continues. You don't need a dramatic confrontation to convince yourself of what you're seeing. You simply know enough. This can also explain why superficial conversations sometimes leave you strangely unsatisfied. You're not necessarily looking for constant seriousness. You can laugh, joke, and enjoy ordinary conversations. But your mind naturally becomes more engaged when there's something underneath the surface. You want to know what someone actually thinks, what motivates them, what they value when nobody is watching, why they made a particular decision, what they are afraid to admit, what they genuinely care about. And when someone gives you an answer that feels rehearsed, your mind may notice the difference immediately. You're listening to the words, but you're also listening to everything around the words: the pauses, the emphasis, the contradictions, the context, the history. All of those pieces combine into a much larger picture. But there's another side to this ability that people rarely talk about: When you notice more, you can also become overwhelmed by more. A crowded room isn't just a crowded room. It's dozens of conversations, facial expressions, movements, sounds, emotional shifts, and social dynamics happening simultaneously. Your brain may continue processing all of it even when you're trying to relax. That's why you may sometimes crave quiet without fully understanding why. You aren't necessarily bored. You may simply need your mind to stop processing everyone else's information for a while. And when you finally get somewhere quiet, you can feel yourself returning to yourself. The noise fades. The observations slow down. Your attention stops jumping from one signal to another. And suddenly, you can think clearly again. This is why heightened awareness needs boundaries. A mind that notices everything doesn't need to analyze everything. You don't have to decode every facial expression. You don't have to understand every silence. You don't have to figure out why someone's mood changed. You don't have to turn every unusual interaction into a psychological puzzle. Sometimes a strange look is just a strange look. Sometimes someone is quiet because they're tired. Sometimes a delayed message means absolutely nothing. And learning to leave some things unexplained can be just as important as learning to notice them in the first place. Because the goal isn't to become someone who sees hidden meanings everywhere. The goal is to become someone who can notice deeply without losing perspective. That is where observation becomes wisdom. And this is where your ability to notice subtle things can become more than just an interesting personality trait. With enough self-awareness, it can become a form of discernment. You begin understanding that not every signal deserves the same amount of attention. Some details are meaningful, some are temporary, and some are simply noise. Your mind becomes less interested in reacting to every change and more interested in identifying which changes actually matter. You may start noticing this in conversations too. Instead of focusing only on what someone says, you pay attention to whether the conversation feels balanced. Are they asking questions, or are they only waiting for their turn to speak? Do they remember things you've told them? Do they become defensive whenever you express a different opinion? Do they treat you differently when other people are around? None of these details alone proves anything, but together, over time, they can tell you a lot about the quality of an interaction. And perhaps you've noticed that you rarely make important judgments about someone after a single conversation. You might have an initial impression, but you allow that impression to change as you gather more information. Someone who seemed arrogant might turn out to be nervous. Someone who seemed incredibly friendly might eventually reveal that their kindness only appears when they want something. You don't necessarily need to label people quickly. You watch, you compare, you update. That ability to revise your impression is actually one of the healthiest forms of psychological observation because it protects you from both navet and unnecessary suspicion. There's also something fascinating about people who naturally notice what others miss. They often become extremely good at detecting changes in themselves. You might notice when your energy is different before anyone else does. You recognize when you're becoming overwhelmed. You can tell when you're forcing yourself to enjoy something. You notice when you're becoming quieter, more irritable, or less interested in something that normally matters to you. That internal observation can become just as important as reading the outside world. Because if you spend all your time analyzing other people, but never examine yourself, awareness can become another form of distraction. The real strength is being able to turn that attention inward too. Why did that conversation bother me so much? Why did I suddenly become defensive? Why do I keep choosing the same type of situation? Why am I uncomfortable with this person? Why do I feel completely different when I'm around certain people? These questions aren't about blaming yourself. They're about understanding your own patterns with the same curiosity you use to understand everyone else. And sometimes the answer surprises you. You may discover that something you thought was intuition was actually fear. You may discover that something you thought was confidence was defensiveness. You may discover that something you thought was sensitivity was simply exhaustion. And you may also discover that some instincts you've been dismissing for years were actually accurate observations that you never gave yourself permission to trust. That's why self-awareness requires balance. You shouldn't believe every feeling automatically, but you shouldn't dismiss every feeling either. You shouldn't assume every instinct is correct, but you shouldn't assume every instinct is meaningless. Instead, you investigate, You gather evidence, you stay curious, and you allow reality to correct you when you're wrong. That mindset can make your perception far more reliable over time, because the most powerful observer isn't the person who believes they can read everyone perfectly. It's the person who knows they can be wrong and is still willing to pay attention. And perhaps that's what separates genuine psychological insight from simply being suspicious of people. Suspicion looks for evidence that confirms what it already believes. Curiosity looks for information, even when that information might prove you wrong. If you naturally notice what others miss, developing that curiosity may be one of the best things you can do with your ability. Because the world doesn't need more people who confidently assume they know what everyone else is thinking. It needs people who can notice carefully, question intelligently, and still remain open to being surprised. And the more you practice this kind of awareness, the more you may notice that you don't need to react immediately to everything you perceive. You can let information sit for a while. You can observe someone without judging them. You can hear an unusual tone without assuming the worst. You can notice a change in your environment without immediately deciding what caused it. That pause is incredibly valuable because it gives your reasoning mind time to catch up with your first impression. This is where emotional intelligence and observation begin to work together. Awareness tells you that something changed. Emotional intelligence helps you decide what to do with that information. Maybe someone needs space. Maybe they need support. Maybe they don't want to talk about it at all. And sometimes the most emotionally intelligent response isn't asking 10 questions. It's simply letting the person know, I'm here if you need me. You may also notice that you become increasingly selective about the people you allow close to you, not because you're trying to build some perfect circle, but because you've learned that constant exposure to unhealthy dynamics affects you more than you once realized. When you pay attention to patterns, you eventually recognize which relationships leave you feeling calm and which ones consistently leave you questioning yourself. One conversation might not tell you much, but repeated interactions do. You notice who respects your boundaries, who listens when you speak, who only contacts you when they need something, who celebrates your success without turning it into competition, who can disagree without becoming disrespectful, who takes responsibility when they make a mistake. These observations don't require paranoia, they require consistency. And perhaps one of the most powerful changes happens when you stop trying to convince yourself that someone's behavior is different from what you've repeatedly observed. Sometimes people tell you who they are through patterns, not declarations. You don't have to hate them. You don't have to expose them. You don't even have to confront them. You can simply adjust your expectations. That is a form of emotional maturity. You can care about someone and still recognize that they aren't good for your life. You can understand someone's behavior and still decide that you don't want to be around it. You can have empathy without giving unlimited access to yourself. And if you've always been someone who notices what others miss, learning that distinction can protect you from one of the biggest dangers of heightened awareness. Understanding people so deeply that you start excusing behavior that continues to hurt you. Understanding is not the same as permission. You can understand why someone behaves a certain way without accepting the consequences of that behavior. You can recognize their wounds without making yourself responsible for healing them. And you can see the reasons behind someone's actions while still holding them accountable for what those actions do. That is when observation stops being something that simply happens to you and becomes something you can use intentionally. You begin using your awareness to choose better environments, better relationships, better decisions, and even better responses to your own emotions. Because perhaps the greatest advantage of noticing what others miss isn't that you can understand other people. It's that eventually you learn to understand yourself with the same level of attention. You begin noticing what energizes you and what drains you, what conversations make you feel alive, what environments make you shrink, what people bring out your confidence, what situations trigger your defensiveness, what patterns you keep repeating. And once you can see those patterns clearly, you gain something much more valuable than the ability to read a room. You gain the ability to read your own life. So if you've always been the person who notices the small things, the pause in someone's voice, the change in their expression, the tension nobody else seems to feel, or the pattern that only becomes obvious later, don't automatically assume that you're overthinking everything. You may simply have a mind that pays unusually close attention. But remember, noticing more doesn't mean you're always right. Real psychological awareness isn't about believing every instinct or assuming you can read everyone's mind. It's about noticing carefully, questioning your first interpretation, looking for patterns, and staying open to being wrong. Because the real strength isn't simply seeing what others don't. It's knowing what to do with what you see. Your observation can help you understand people without judging them. Your sensitivity can help you respond without becoming overwhelmed. Your intuition can guide you without controlling your decisions. And your awareness can help you understand yourself instead of constantly analyzing everyone else. Perhaps that's the most important thing to take away from this entire video. The goal isn't to become someone who sees hidden meanings everywhere. The goal is to become someone who can see clearly without losing perspective. So the next time you notice something that everyone else seems to overlook, pause before dismissing yourself, and pause before assuming you're completely right. Observe it. Question it. Give reality time to reveal the answer. Because sometimes your mind really did notice something important. And sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is simply admit, I noticed it, but I don't know what it means yet. That combination of awareness, curiosity, and humility is where genuine psychological insight begins. And maybe you've spent your entire life wondering why you notice things other people don't. Now you have a better question to ask. What can I do with the way my mind sees the world? Because seeing differently isn't automatically a gift or a problem. It's a responsibility, and when you learn to use it wisely, it can become one of your greatest strengths. It's remaining kind after seeing the parts of people that are difficult to understand. It's remaining humble despite your insight. It's remaining open to new evidence even when your intuition feels strong. And it's remembering that true wisdom is not measured by how accurately you read the world around you, but by how peacefully you live within it. If this video helped you understand your own mind a little better, share it with someone who always seems to notice the little things everyone else overlooks. Sometimes, the greatest gift isn't teaching people how to see more. It's helping them understand that seeing deeply doesn't have to come at the cost of their peace. Keep questioning, keep learning, and above all, keep exploring the remarkable psychology of the human mind. And if you see yourself in this video, if you've always noticed what others miss, remember this: you are not alone. So among the 3 psychological traps we just explored, which one do you fall into the most? And more importantly, are you ready to commit to practicing these 3 principles to protect your mind? Share in the comments. I'd really like to hear your story. If today's video brought you value, hit like and share it with someone who might also be struggling with an overly sensitive mind. Your understanding today could completely change someone's day. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Don't forget to subscribe to keep exploring the hidden sides of psychology. Goodbye, and I'll see you next.